Hi guys, and welcome to the NES iceberg. I got the inspiration by Reddit post. I'll link it to the description. I made some minor tweaks and changed it to the iceberg by adding and removing some of the entries. And if you don't know what an iceberg chart is, on the top of the iceberg is the more well-known things, and the lower you go, the more unknown and just plain weird entries sit. Without further ado, let's dive into the NES iceberg. The Famicom was basically a Japanese version of the NES, which came out 2 years before the NES in 1983. It also single-handedly revived the Japanese video game market. Also a random fact, the Famicom didn't get discontinued until 2003, 20 years after it released. The D-pad was introduced and popularized on the NES, and has been on every mainline Nintendo controller since, not including Joy-Cons, which technically have it. It's kind of weird. The Minus World is one of the most famous glitches in gaming. In Super Mario Bros. 1-2, you need to jump in a tiny invisible place near the warp zone, and if pulled off, you go into the Minus World. When you reach the end of the level, there's a pipe, which only soft locks you. But in the Japanese version of the game, there's multiple Minus Worlds. The Princess is another castle. It's a famous line. If you defeat Bowser in Worlds 1-7 in Super Mario Bros., you'll see Toad who says that line. There's a funny song about this, and I'll link it in the description. Rob, which is short for Robot Operating Buddy, was an accessory bundled with lots of NESs, and was compatible with only 2 games. In more recent times, Rob was a cameo as a fighter in Super Smash Bros. Series and one of the 12 characters in Mario Kart DS. This one's interesting. When Super Mario Bros. 2 came out in 1987, it was deemed too hard for North American gamers, and a game Nintendo created called Doki Doki Panic became Super Mario Bros. 2 everywhere else, with Mario characters. And also, American Mario Bros. 2 became known as Super Mario Bros. USA, and Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 became known as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels everywhere else, and it didn't make its first appearance until Super Mario All-Stars. The NES Zapper was an accessory bundled in with some NESs and was used for 2 games, Hogan's Alley and Duck Hunt, but most known for its use in Duck Hunt. The Konami code was a famous cheat code used by Konami in Konami games and even some non-Konami games. Its most famous use is in Contra. This one is simple. This is referring to different sets that the NES came in. This was an accessory made by Mattel, not Nintendo, where you supposedly control games with your hand. It was kind of worse. It was kind of the Wii remote, but worse for the NES. The accessory was popularized by the 1989 movie The Wizard with the quote, "I love the Power Glove. It's so bad." He wasn't lying. It was bad. The NES Classic Edition was a mini version of the NES made in 2017, preloaded with 30 NES games. Lots of companies followed this trend, like Sony with the PlayStation Classic. That one was not as good as the Nintendo ones. The Game Genie was a famous cheating device made in 1990 for the NES, and probably its most famous use is for Super Mario Bros. This one's interesting. The Famicom Disk System was an accessory for Famicom, which uses floppy disks. Iconic games like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid first came out on the disk system. There's a video in the description by gaming historian about this topic, which goes much more in depth, and this leads up to our next entry. Mr. Disk was the mascot for the Famicom Disk System. LJN was a toy and video game company. They are most known for the bad NES games, which were probably the worst games on the entire console. Game Historian also has a great video on this topic. I'll link into the description. Del Ward was a game created by Shigeru Miyamoto in 1984, and interestingly didn't get released in North America over the use of religious icons. The design of the protagonist, Tamagon, inspired Yoshi's design, and the antagonist eventually became an assist trophy in Super Smash Bros. Fun fact, this is Shigeru Miyamoto's first game, and its only game not to be released in North America. This refers to the NES design looking like a VHS player because it wouldn't get confused with a video game console since the video game industry was failing. The NES Advantage was an NES controller designed like an arcade controller. Battletoads was a game released in 1991 and is well known as one of the hardest video games ever. Warriors Words was a game released very late in the NES's lifespan in 1994. That's 3 years after the SNES came out. This is really the only NES game with Wario in it, and the first game with Toad as the hero. The Legend of Zelda was originally thought to be planned on the NES. Eventually, it evolved into The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which is one of the greatest video games of all time. For some reason, the Famicon's second controller has a mic. In the comments, tell me it's used, because I don't know. The new style NES, mostly known as the top loader, was a revision of the NES very late in the NES lifespan. In 1993, 2 years after the SNES came out, and it came out with new controllers known as the dog bone controllers. Also, the top loaders had a new design. Nintendo World Championships was a video game tournament hosted by Nintendo and became one of the first esports competitions ever. There's also a cartridge for it, but we'll talk about that later. The Power Pad was an accessory used in the game's semi-stadium events, which is one of the rarest games to this day. It was kind of the early version of the Wii balance board. Justin Billy is a famous password in Metroid, which makes it so Samus starts out without a parachute. Normally you need to beat Metroid in less than 3 hours to play as Zero Suit Samus. The Dendy was basically a Russian bootleg of the NES released after the SNES came out. The Hyundai Convoy was a little-known, insanely rare release of the NES in South Korea, and it was produced by Korean car company Hyundai. Super Mario no Sweater was a little-known Japanese exclusive game which was released in 1986, where he designed a sweater of Mario, Luigi, Peach, and Bowser. Tengen Tetris was a Tetris prototype on the NES, which was recalled only a month after it was on the shelves. This game was one of the rarest NES games ever made. Some people say that Tengen Tetris was better than the famous Game Boy Tetris because there's a 2-player mode. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was an NES game released in 1986, which surprisingly, basically Donkey Kong Jr. but with math, and it didn't have good reviews because everybody likes math, right? Imagine if kids in the 1980s learned how to do math because of this game. This was basically internet on the Famicom before internet became popular. This paved the way for its teleview on the Super Famicom. Interestingly enough, the best-selling game on the accessory was betting on horse racing. You wouldn't expect that to be the best-selling game on something video game related. This is referring to 2 cartridges, one given away for the finalists at the Nintendo World Championship in 1990, and the second one was for Nintendo Power. Both of them are stupidly, insanely rare. This final entry of the iceberg refers to this Australian ad. Whatever the hell this is. Imagine if you're a kid in the 1980s and this pops up at 10 p.m. This is pure nightmare fuel here. So that is the NES iceberg. If you like this video, press the like button and the subscribe button to help me put this video in the algorithm. If you don't like this video, do none of those things. But seriously, I'm a small channel trying to grow, and liking and subbing would help a lot. If this video gets enough support, I'll do more icebergs in the future. Okay, bye.